Ash is going to stay up on stage and we are going to welcome the presenters from this morning. So Phil, Zac and Tim, could you please come up? Tim Watts is going to chair this session. He's the WALRAC chair here in WA. And we're going to link the presentations from, there's down there. We're going to link the presentations this morning together. So that is going to be Tim's lovely role. Are you going to take questions from the floor throughout the session? So this is your chance to ask, how does this apply to what Zac talked about this morning? Phil, what did you mean about that? And go, hey Ash, can you put some back of the envelope numbers on that for me? So I'll leave it to you boys. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgia. Whilst the team are taking their seats on stage, I'm going to introduce you to the next session as being one of audience participation. And guess what? I'm looking at them. So the first thing I'd like you to do is identify a neighbour on your table, and I want you to tell them, and you've only got 20 seconds to do this, the most recent new pasture species that you have utilised on your farm. All you have to do is tell them the name of it. Righto, go. Okay, 20 seconds is up, and if I leave you to go any longer, I'm going to lose control of you all. Okay, so that was step one, and now there's a step two in all of this, and that is, by show of hands, those people, please put up their hand if that introduction to that new pasture species did something to improve your long-term carrying capacity. Right up high, please. Very good. Those who did not see any change or rejected the species. Hands up. Oh, that's a positive outcome, isn't it? Isn't that lovely? What a high success rate. Okay, so that was just a really simple example of what WALRAC does. We go and do about between 8 and 10 forums in the regions each year, and we look for your input as producers as to what's important in terms of the issues driving your and limiting your productivity on farm. We listen, we aggregate all those comments up, and then once a year we draft up and decide on priorities for on-farm improvement, and we forward those to MLA. MLA then use those priorities alongside of CELRAC and NABRAC's priorities to create terms of reference which drive the applications for research, development and adoption. It's as simple as that. That's our role. And so little questions like I just asked, in far greater detail of course, is what we do. So this session now is a little bit more about that sort of detail where we've got an opportunity to drill down using these three excellent presentations that we've had this morning to try and understand a little better how it is that some of the comments that they've made can help us overcome barriers to adoption or overcome existing limitations to what we do on farm. So whilst you think about the questions you might like to ask or the remarks that you want to make, and there'll be roving microphones to allow you to do that, I'm just going to ask a question and see if we can't get the ball rolling. So my question, if I may, is firstly to you, Ash, and then comments from the other two. All of you have talked about the need for scale and intensity of operation, but in driving towards that intensity of operation, what comes first? Is it the efficiency of the usage of the dry matter that you're producing through time of lambing and sale decisions, or is it simply pushing stocking rate to its limit?
Oh, fine. It's interesting. I remember remember speaking to a group of CSBP people some years ago, and stocking rate's always interesting because as soon as you say stocking rate, you just got to mention those two words, stocking rate, the audience just goes. And I was talking to these CSBP people, like they don't even have sheep. And you got the yeah, but, right? And that's always troubled me. But what I think is as soon as you say stocking rate, people jump to the extreme. Bare soil, skinny sheep, dead sheep. You know, you sort of think, well, that's not what stocking rate is, but that's the image it conjures up. So I say that because that's exactly what you said 2 seconds ago. So timer lambing, the issue with timer lambing is that it gives you total flexibility to manage seasonal variation at the start. If you're lambing in April, May, or any time in that period, your options to manage seasonal variation are one, and that's just feeding lots, because you can't do, once they're lambing, you can't do anything. So if you can't defer graze, you can't confine graze, you can't sell anything. So consequently, to manage that risk, people run low stocking rates because you never want to get it wrong, and that's totally fair enough. That's one of the reasons. The other reason is they want big fat finished lambs at the end, and you can't do that if you're lambing in July and you've only got 4 months growing season. So I think in order to be able to manage your feed efficiency, you can't be lambing early because you've got peak stocking rate at a time of the year when the farm's got the least capacity to manage it, and you're understocked thereafter. Now, what we've seen the last few years is, because we've had dry starts, the autumn lambing pastures have been totally overgrazed. Come springtime, they haven't recovered. So you might think, oh, well, the stocking rate was right. It was only right because it'd been hammered all year. It had no capacity to recover. So you were overstocked right up until the peak of spring. Whereas people that had capacity to defer graze, they actually grew more dry matter to run more sheep in a poor year. And you can't do that if you're lambing early. So I think my first thing is that you've got to address the time of lambing issue before you can start to address stocking rate.
So that opens the door.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. Zac, you've done it, haven't you? And you explained that earlier. Where do you see that change of time of lambing? Can you speculate as to where that might lead to for you in terms of the winter stocking rate?
We're still running. So my father he's running one block and he's doing it traditionally. He never changed from Anzac Day drop. And then, just side by side, our two blocks, even though they're slightly different soil and rainfall, they're pretty much the same. But, comparing them side by side, the difference is just amazing. So I'll run mine with a late lambing, and last year was a poor year, but I had the option, because they're dropping so late, I knew that, it hadn't rained, we hadn't had an early break or anything. So initially I was set up to capitalise on a good year, and then it wasn't turning out to be a good year. So I sold down 1,000 ewes. They were just, people bought them locally, and then I was able to manage the risk that way, and then grew enough fodder and had a good lambing.
And did you see any, or in negotiations with your brother, the cropping bellows, did that come into the discussion? In other words, backing off cropping when you've got a poor year looming, or is that opportunity already passed?
No, it's locked in. Yeah, we don't communicate too well. It happens, so that's just locked in. They're growing that amount of crop, and that's it.
And the gate's shut.
Yep.
Right, Phil, do you have a comment about this setting yourself up to carry more sheep or more cattle?
Yeah, I think that perhaps our traditional approach, and it's what Ash says, the message was that you just run more sheep, and it didn't sit well with people because they thought it was overdoing it and there'd just be a train wreck. So I think it often takes people to change a few things and then suddenly see more feed than you've ever seen before, and then you go, hang on, now I can actually see the lift in stocking rate because I'm almost wasting grass. And I think people that have done some of the confinement feeding and sowing in cereals and things, and then they get to like June, July, and they go, I've never had feed like this. And that gives a bit of confidence. So it's hard
with fat sheep.
Yes, with well looked after sheep. So it hasn't been a compromise. So I think there is a bit of having to see it, and then, but you're seeing it, but you know you've got this more robust system as well. So that you know if you have a bit tougher year, you've still got some, you know, some things in play.
Very good. Okay. All of you talked around the subject of confinement feeding. If I might go to that autumn feed gap discussion that we've had. And please, if you've got a question, just stick up your hand and we'll get you a microphone. But in the meantime, Phil, just moving on from that, confinement feeding was mentioned in all of your talks. The adoption of it is, if I may say so, at an industry level, at its early stages. Yep. And people like myself, I do the numbers, already late lambing, and I find myself with a back of envelope estimate of something like $8 or $9 per sheep per month. And I go, whoa, where am I going to get that? How do I get that money back? How do I make it pay?
Yeah. Well, the simple way, I think, is that you would only do confinement feeding if you can see a lift in stocking rate. And I suppose the other one is you might see a slight lift in sheep performance per head. But I think most of it is going to come through from a stocking rate improvement. If you just implement confinement feeding and don't change your stocking rate, you're probably likely to go backwards. Your pastures might go forwards, but financially you might go backwards. So you've got to do it with the end result. Like, what's the aim? The aim is to grow more feed and run more sheep. So, you know, you might have to set yourself a target of whatever it is, 1 or 2 extra DSC.
Yep.
And it might not just be confinement feeding. You might, I think pastures respond, or they do respond differently to deferral. Some respond more than others, and probably a more productive pasture responds more than a poor productive pasture. You can defer it for a long time and it still doesn't grow much dry matter. Yeah. So there's a bit of that going on. You need to have a responsive pasture to get the most out of the deferral confinement.
Good. Ash, quick comment? Okay, sorry to steal your thunder, Ed. I didn't mean to do that. Daniel, a question.
So Phil and Zac, you both talk about many species for the autumn feed gap and in general. And the new species that you talk was the data that will be less known for most of the people here. So I would like you to expand a bit in the mainly Zac. How was the grazing itself? How is the recovery after grazing? How is it grazing now? How is this growing now in winter time? And as a tool to extend the growing season, that we have been hearing how important is the length of the growing season, and this can be extending the growing season maybe 1.5 months before and 1.5 months after. So if you can comment about that, please.
Well, it's only in its first year, but it's quite... The amount of feed it does grow in autumn, where everything else was, just pure dust. So it was only a small paddock, 14 hectares, and we essentially using it as a drought pen because we had 400 sheep in there. So that was 30 DSC. So it's a small pen. They're all locked up in there, and we hardly had to supplement them. And meanwhile, the pastures were getting away. So that's one benefit there. And we grazed it right down to, there was just sticks left. And there was no adverse effects on the sheep. They put on condition. So, that was a benefit. And then currently now, a couple of months later, it's back to what it originally was. So you'd call that quite fast recovery. And then the next part of the project is putting fat lambs in there at weaning. So there'll be October sometime, and we can measure the growth rates of them compared to. I'm not sure what the control will be, but probably a good Cerridella paddock or something. So, yeah, it's got good recovery and seems pretty good. Can't really fault it, except for the establishment period. That's a negative.
Okay, good questions. Over coffee, Phil and I were chatting about Tadera, and we were speculating about how it could possibly fit in alternative production systems. Phil, do you want to summarise quickly what we said? We were talking about whether it would provide shelter for lambing ewes, for example, and how the grazing timing impacts that autumn feed gap. I think that was a good discussion.
Yeah, so I mean the Tadera, even though it's a perennial, it seems to be happier in the winter and the spring than it does in the summer and the autumn to a degree, and that's partly due to temperature and probably partly due to moisture. So in the project, we've identified that obviously May is right smack bang in the middle of the autumn feed gap, so utilising it then gives it immense value. Whereas we did discuss, maybe we could hold this over and lamb on it because it'll provide great shelter and it's good quality. But at the time, we went, no, hang on, that May feed is so valuable. But I think it's worth exploring, as we get more paddocks, how we utilise it. Yep. And then obviously the spring concept was that if we are July lambing and we get to October, often feed quality is the limiting factor in October and November, not feed quantity. And so having something that's high, and it being a legume and being leafy, it is high quality. So it sort of that's a great fit for that system. But you could easily graze Tadera, right through the winter and spring. You can lightly graze it over the summer. But it's probably about picking moments when it's going to do a job that other things aren't doing. So that's about, my forage chain. Partly it's about you've got little needs from pastures, it might be finishing or just keeping animals alive. And so that's been the discussion between the producers and Daniel and myself, trying to work out where the best value is. I don't think we have the answer, but that's our current thinking.
And as your thoughts extended to using it as a fodder shrub with an interrow of something else and exploiting differential palatabilities?
Not yet, but one of the producers, we were talking it through and saying it's a perennial legume. Slowly over time, we're wondering whether the soil nitrogen is going to build up and whether the system will get a bit out of whack. So he broadcast a bit of barley into it to see. Too early to tell, but that when you're discovering a new plant, there's lots of unknowns.
Righto, numbers man, Ashley. How does Tadera stack up? How are you going to evaluate it in a dollars per hectare sense? What approach do you take? That's question without notice. I've got him.
Here's another question without notice. How tall does Tadera grow? If you left it ungrazed?
I'll say knee-high-ish. Knee-high-ish.
About there,
being, thereabouts. Not super tall.
It's still tall enough to be a good shelter for lambs.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yep.
Gee, right. I wasn't actually listening to what you were talking about. So.
Sorry to be so riveting, Adrian.
I have to confess.
I'm not re-asking.
Maybe I can think about it while Ken asks his scintillating question.
My question is sort of a follow-on from Tim's comment about objectifying. Zac and Phil have given some really good subjective benefits from confinement feeding and Tadera, but has anybody objectified it by putting a dollar value on what are the financial benefits of deferring? We get better pastures, but how do you put a value on that and subtract the value of the inputs you have to have for confinement feeding? So I guess what I'm saying is you need to convince people, not just with subjective stuff, but put objective values on it, and dollars is everybody understands them, so that's probably the most logical thing to do.
I think you're quite right, Ken. Now, Ed, you covering that after lunch? Is that you?
Yes.
Yeah, so, Ken, shortcut,
discuss it. You can argue it with me after lunch.
Yeah, but I will just say, in my experience, I don't think I've met anyone that started confinement feeding and stopped. When people start, they don't go back. It's like when you lamb in July, I don't think I've ever met anyone that's reverted back to the old ways. It's a one-way street, and that tells me something about. Yeah, Ed'll tune you on that one. Yeah, so Karis. Oh, John. Crikey.
It is about you, Ashley, but not quite perhaps to you. But one of the other skills we need to have as farmers is to be able to predict the future a bit, isn't it? And do we buy that $2,000 cow or do we buy the $200 ewe? And I will remind you of an answer you gave me in a forum like this probably 10 or 15 years ago in Mount Barker, Ashley. I don't know if you remember it, but we were talking about grazing management, I think it was. And I did suggest to you that perhaps we could run cattle to solve that problem. And you said, I did suggest that it might be desperate to use cattle to graze it. And you said, I don't think I'll ever be desperate enough to graze it with cattle. But given today's situation economically, I don't know, should you buy that $2,000 cow or $200 ewe?
Well, you're asking me, right? Well, yeah.
I mean, look, that's what we're looking at the moment, isn't it?
Well, it depends what your skill base is, and it depends what your farm's set up for. If you're a cow person with cow facilities, you're a bit stuck. If you're a sheep person with sheep facilities, sheep's your thing. Well, my personal view is, and what I said before, I've never seen cattle make more money than sheep. Now, yeah. But people still run cows in sheep areas, and that's their choice. And there's a whole range of reasons why people do what they do. But if it was purely about making money, in the wheat belt, sheep are the dominant livestock enterprise for that very reason, because they make the most money by and large. Yeah, well.
No, we run both. I enjoy running sheep more, but I also enjoy cattle, so I think I'll just keep it the same. I'm just lucky that we held on to them and didn't settle down like a lot of other people in the bad times. But for me, it's just enjoyable. So,
and they serve a purpose in your landscape.
Yeah, so they're good. Obviously everyone knows they graze different things and they're easy to shift around, and there's cash flow at different times of the year, and we just like running a mixed enterprise. So I think I'll just keep it how it is.
That's a good answer. And John, I read on Mercado the other day that there's no better solution to high prices than high prices. I think that's an oldie, isn't it? But how true is it? Yeah, and wool, if you're at the right end of the spectrum. So interesting times. Okay, I'd like to finish up on one last issue, if I may, that I picked out of...
There's a question at the back there too.
Oh, you better give it... It's Erin. I better receive a question from Erin.
I did ask if there was time. There was. Just quickly, question to Zac and all of you at the same time. You slightly touched on it. Adoption's a big thing for me. We spend a lot of money on the R. You touched on the utilisation of crop grazing within your system. You're the livestock person in your business. You've got a brother in the cropping part of the business. How do you make the decisions around running the livestock onto the cropping paddock that might be doing whatever, and there's research to show that the crop will come back? How does that work as a business to be able to make those decisions utilising crops, for example?
Well, the gate comes open. That's how we get around it. So it is difficult because, my brother wants to grow the best crops that he can grow. And, if you're looking at it from a whole business, I would say, we could run more sheep, but it gets complicated around the table. So we tried it a little bit and then just left it. So we don't do it. But that's what I want to do in the future. So now I just, had a disc seeder that we're going through, grassy pastures or, and I'll just put in barley that way and get my crop grazing fix like that. But I would love to. No, I'd love to do it in the future. So that's something to work towards.
Okay, can we jump the fence? And I'll just throw this one at our panel. Phil, you mentioned ryegrass a couple of times, and how it ought to. My interpretation is that we're saying it ought to be the basis of all our pastures, long-term pastures, because of its productivity. But it, as you all know, as we all know, it runs counter to the other side of our mixed farming enterprise. I'd love some intuitive comments from all of you about how we manage that successfully, given that the croppers will be out there trying to kill every last blade of it that they can find.
Gee, how long have we got, Tim?
Yes, it's a big question, I know, but it's an important part of our production system that doesn't match up very well, does it?
Yeah. So I think one thing comes back to what does the crop rotation look like? So that's one part of it. Because if it's just 1 year of pasture in between a whole lot of cropping, then you'll probably put some cereal in the ground and maybe if you've got enough rainfall and enough expectation of perhaps a longer season ryegrass, but knowing that that'll be grazed and then spray topped out. So it's just a 1 year disposable pasture. But if you're, say, coming out of 5 years of crop and going into 5 years of pasture, then it's a whole nother scenario, isn't it? So, I mean, I remember going to Kojonup and they say, we go cropping so we can grow ryegrass. Because in the pasture, they keep grazing it out. In the crop, they keep growing it. So that doesn't happen everywhere. It happens particularly in that part of the world where ryegrass really grows like a weed.
And our tolerance for that is diminishing rapidly as the proportion of crop increases.
As we get better at cropping, yep, and there's probably less of those rotations going around. Yep.
Any producers want to comment on that, how they deal with ryegrass long term? No, they're listening, obviously, guys.
Tim, the cropping thing is more successful now than it's ever been, and the big problem that's quite common is when you put a paddock out of crop into pasture, you're never sure whether there's going to be any weeds in it or not, and half the time nothing comes up and you think, well, now what do I do? So the chemicals and the execution and all the other bits that people are doing in their cropping is extraordinarily successful. I used to say crop a paddock for 4 or 5 years and, because by then it's full of weeds and it goes back, whereas these days, I think what works best is just keep cropping it until it's quite weedy, and that could take 10 years, could take 12, might take 5. But the cropping techniques are so successful against weeds these days, it's quite unreliable for a stubble to go back into pasture and generate lots of high density unless it's obviously weedy. And that's been a real hiccup in the last couple of years when we've had poor seasons. You think a stubble's going to carry a few sheep and nothing germinates, and then you're sort of stuck then because you've got this paddock it's not crop, but it's not pasture either, and that's quite a risk, which is why people now routinely just seed everything with something to make sure something comes up.
Karis, you have a question there?
With ryegrass becoming more resistant to various types of chemicals, is there the option to use that as a weapon in your pasture systems to spray out unwanted grasses?
Oh, that's done. Yeah, people, you can spray it if you like, and all the nasties die, and the ryegrass stays. That's quite yes. I remember when that was first mooted as a technique back in the sort of mid-90s. The poor old person got howled down as you can't do that. It's outrageous, but it's common practice now. So what he was suggesting was we should go and get some of this resistant ryegrass from the wheat belt and sow it into our pastures. And of course, at that time, resistance was still quite new, and that didn't sit very well. But it's happened, and
and works beautifully, in my experience.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Jim.
Yeah, as someone who's been fairly intensively rotational grazing for the last 20 or so years, my question really is why not roll all these things all these ideas that you've had into all your paddocks on the farm, so that you've got, all your different species. We're all told about biodiversity being the, really important thing. If you've got it in all your paddocks and you've got that option to graze it, when you want, how much better off would it be?
And you've got 5 seconds to answer.
Oh, that's the holy grail, and I'm moving towards it, but, water points and it's all hard and labour, and so there's always something for me not to do it, but I'm working towards rotational grazing.
Short and sweet, I like that. Our time monitor has said we've got to pull up, so thank you for your participation, and I'd like you to warmly thank our panel for their further comments.